So lately I've been working on this tooltip component, and I've come across some interesting challenges with regards to the tests that go with this component. So I thought I would go over some of those, and hopefully they'll help you in some of the tests that you have to write. So this is the component here. It's just a simple tooltip. It's using the Radix tooltip library under the hood, but basically if I mouse over it, I can highlight and see the message that is in the tooltip. It can be pushed to different parts of the tooltip. Can actually, I can show it down here, and you can see even though it's got top as the preferred side, it reflects it down to the bottom if it's going to go off the screen. So it does some pretty cool stuff, and you can also set the text. Looking at the storybook associated with this, we can see that this is where the tooltip's used, and with the primitive, which is what we're going to use for this test, for the test and for the purposes of this video, the trigger is specified as a child to the component, and the text message content is in the text attribute. So let's go through and figure out how we could test this. Now, a lot of times when I create a component like this, or when one might create it, they go, hey, how do you actually test this via a unit test? It's a lot of interactivity, visual things. It's actually pretty easy to do. So let's go through this. I'm going to remove the storybook for now, and we'll start our tests over here. On my left side here. So I have some tests running. Normally I would use Wallaby, which is a great in the editor unit test runner for running these, but there are a couple of minor issues with some of the inline snapshots and stuff that I'll be going over, and so I opted to use just the watch mode in here. And I've got a template for the primitive already set up here for testing the primitive, tooltip primitive.test. And you'll notice I have this test.todo function. This is actually a really useful thing to use because this allows us to create just these skipped functions. Actually, you can see them, they're reflected as one to do, and it will see those and acknowledge that there's a test there yet to be written. Versus like if I did a test, it's like, well, let's just turn this from a to-do into an actual function, and if I just even have that empty, it shows it as passed. I actually, when I'm making a list of functionality to test and getting an idea of things that I want to test, I prefer to use the test.todo function because then it actually shows up as a to-do on my list rather than as a passed function, because when I look at my list of passed tests right here, it doesn't tell me that I actually have something to implement. So what are some things that we would want to test? Well, first of all, we want to test that it renders that trigger, that the trigger that we pass to the component, it actually renders that inside of the page, which is important. And we'd want to test a couple other things with the interaction of the tooltip. So one really nice thing, for instance, would be to be able to test that when we hover over the trigger, that the tooltip opens. And then it conversely closes when we don't hover over it. Another one, it's part of the accessibility functionality of this component, is that we'd want to be able to test when the component has focus, or rather when the trigger has focus, whether the tooltip shows up or not. So let's go through some of these tests. So actually, let's write some of these out. So to do, let's see, tooltip appears when hovering over trigger. So these are tests that we know we want to implement. And finally, a test to do. Let's do another one. Tooltip, let's see, appears when trigger has focus. And we'll kind of imply in both of those that where it's appearing, that we'll also just, because it's going to save us some time, that we'll probably just test that the tooltip also disappears when we unhover or unfocus off of that component. So let's write some of these. So and hopefully I can show you a couple tricks here as we go through. So let's implement this one. So rendering the trigger. So to render something, of course, we use the render function from the React testing library. And what are we rendering? We're rendering our tooltip primitive. Actually, we can probably just take some of the content. Let's see. This is our storybook. So we don't need the side. We're not going to worry about testing the side. That actually gets delegated to the radix library that we're using, so I'm not that worried about using that, but we do need to specify a message and a trigger. So let's put a trigger in there. Oh, and it's warning us that we need to set text, so we'll just set a text to tooltip message. Okay, so rendering's working and our test should pass. We aren't doing anything. Now, what do we want to test here? We want to test that the trigger appears. Now, there's a tendency out there to all of a sudden, oh, I better put a data test ID on this, my button or whatever, so that I can find it. Don't need to do that, especially in unit tests. Such an extra markup that's just unnecessary. Now, our QA engineers have asked for data test IDs on certain elements, and so we do need to put them on there. But I'd rather for these shared components leave that as a exercise for the consumer of the component, because they're going to know the specific name that they want on that trigger, assuming that they want to put one on the trigger. For a tooltip like this, most of the time they're not going to want to. So what do we do instead? Well, we have other facilities at our disposal. We have another one, and we'll go over some of these selectors or queries in just a minute, but I want to get access to the trigger. Well, the trigger is a button, and the most useful thing that you can use in your tests is selecting things by role. So we know that this is a button. There's only one button in here, so we could just do it like that. And but you can, if you have multiple buttons on the page and you want to select a specific one, you can add an additional thing. Like what I'll do here, I'll explain this in just a minute here. Let's just do trigger. This is a regular expression that says I want the button whose name, which is the content, has a trigger. And now we should be able to expect trigger to be in the document. And hopefully this passes. Okay, yeah, so it passes. Now really, truth be told, I should have probably, let's just take this out for a minute, the part that it actually triggers, and it should fail, but it's going to fail before it even gets to our assertion, because it didn't find something matching get by role on the page. There are different forms of queries that you can use with your selectors. Get by role is the most common one, and it says, I want to find an element that matches this rule here, but if I don't find it, I'm going to throw an error, because the expectation when you have a get on these is that the element is currently present on the page. There are a couple of other selectors, and let's just go over those. So the types of queries that you have, this is in the React testing library documentation. You have get by that returns that single node, and it has to be present, and it throws an error if it doesn't. Query by, on the other hand, is a safer way. So what it does is it returns the node if it's present, or gives you, I believe, null. Yeah, null if no elements match. So that's a good one to use for like the presence of something currently on the page, because it doesn't throw an error at the time you're trying to select it. And so that feels like the appropriate one for testing the presence of an element on there, and that's why I switched it. Finally, there's this find by one, which we'll be using momentarily, which allows us to do asynchronous or promise-based fetching of nodes. We're going to need that for some of our asynchronous behavior. Oh, and also I should point out here, just so we don't have to come back to this page, these multiple element ones, they have get all, query all, and find all, which allow you to get multiple nodes. And the get all is kind of the same, except for it throws an error if it doesn't find any nodes matching at all. Okay, so that's our selectors there. So let's go back to our tests. So we're going to use query by, because we don't want it to fail when we're selecting it. We want it to fail on our assertion. And so if this is null, it's going to return that. We could even do something here like, to match, the text content, but we don't really need to, because we included really the button trigger name in the selector here. Then we know this node is really this node right here, and it's put in. It's a reasonable assumption that the content of the button is going to match, and it's not some other button that it's added. Okay, so let's try one of these more interesting ones. So tooltip appears when hovering over trigger. So we can do the same render, but we want to interact with the component a little bit. So let's just add that render in here. You notice, yes, it's a little bit of code duplication, and what? Oh, commas are important. Okay, so it's a little bit of code duplication, but it's nicer to actually see what's going on in the test if you either abstract things to functions or you have them inline in the test. So you don't have to go a lot of different places to figure out where things are at and what setup code is running prior to your test. So I'm going to render. Now here, we need to be able to do a couple of things. We need to be able to see, first of all, that the tooltip is not present. Then we hover over our trigger and see that the tooltip is present, and then let's just go to that point. So let's actually start with the simpler one. So we'll start with user event dot hover. Oh, and then we need our element. Well, what's our element? It's screen get by element. Actually, let's just have this as a variable. We'll just call this trigger, kind of like we did up here. We'll just take this query by role, except for we're going to change it to get by role. We're not going to check and see whether the trigger's there. We already did that in a previous unit test. This one we'll just assume that the trigger's there because this one's focusing on hovering over an element. So we'll hover over the trigger, and then we had that await, or that waiting for the element to be present. And let's see, that selector was called find by. So what we're going to want to do here is we're going to wait, and what are we going to find? We're going to go to our screen. Well, tooltips, and fortunately the Radix library follows the accessibility things. Tooltips also have a role on them, so we can do await for that tooltip to show up. Oh, and the await, that means we need to add an async to our thing, because this is going to be some asynchronous code. And then basically, after we await for it, and once it's present, we want to just expect that get by role tooltip, and let's do something like to have text content tooltip message. And we could have this as a regex on this one too, but we'll just do something like that. Let's see what our tests are doing here. Oh, look at that. The tests pass. Let's just verify that. They just make a little change here. Okay. So it's passing. So it's hovering. And one thing that we should do in tests like this when we're detecting a new thing on there is whether the element is already present on the page. Now this kind of captures that, so we really shouldn't have to worry about it, but we could be more explicit. The easiest way to do that would be to add another expectation, screen query by role tooltip, because it may or may not be there, not to be in the document. There we go. So we could add that to our tests to go, hey, it wasn't there, and then we hovered, and then it was there. To see that it goes away. And sometimes with these user event kind of things, you have to fiddle with them a little bit. Here we have an unhover. So what we want to do here is, I know for a fact on this library that the tooltip immediately goes away when you unhover. It doesn't have any kind of delay and then wait, kind of like it did on the initial one. So we'll just do expect screen query by. Actually, let's just do the original one. Let's take that selector, and we'll say, so it wasn't there, we hovered, we waited for it to appear, because there is a delay, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We waited for it to appear and then validated that it had the right content. Then we unhovered off of it, and we assert that it's not in the document. So let's run that. So it's got through this whole interaction, this whole flow. There, it passes. So there in just a few lines of code, we've actually tested that interaction, that the element appears and disappears based on interactions that we're having with the component. So this is how you can test some of this stuff just using a unit test. And we could argue all day about whether this is truly a unit test or anything else like that. The point is you're increasing confidence in the functionality of your code by actually testing that it works in an automated fashion. Now, one thing that I'm a little not very happy about is that the time that this test takes to run. So the original test only took about 78 milliseconds. This one takes almost half a second, actually over half a second. That's too long. Well, let's see if we can figure out why it's doing that. So let's remove the stories just so we have more space here. The tooltip primitive has this delay duration of 500 milliseconds. So that's probably where we're getting it from. In fact, if we took this and reduced this down to 0, you see the test runs about the same amount of time as our other one, really fast. And the default delay, I think, is like 700 milliseconds. So we'll probably see, almost 800 milliseconds here. Yeah, you can see that on the case. So let's go back to what we had. I reduced it down to 500. Let's see if we can speed up this test. So one of the ways that we can do that, most of the time when you have delays, is that it's using things like set interval or set timeout to wait on certain behavior. Well, one of the ways in our test that we can speed that up a little bit, because we don't want this test to get slower and slower if we have to extend that delay. We want our test to be fast. So one thing we can add up at the top of our file is use fake timers. What this does is it replaces all of our timer related functions, set timeout, dates, and intervals with ticks, it replaces those as well with mock implementations of those timers using the sign-on mock library to do that. So if we just put that in there, use fake timers, and that's all we're going to do. That's the one line of code. See how fast this got? 84 milliseconds. Really, really fast. That's something that works well by itself, but you will find is that if these delays get any larger, so let's extend that out to 1,000 milliseconds, and this one may still work. Nope, and it doesn't. Now, part of that is some of the behavior in timeouts within the Jest framework still hold. One thing that's an important note in our selector here is in our find by, it says if it checks and waits until 1,000 milliseconds have passed, and if it doesn't find something within 1,000 milliseconds, whether it's mocked or not, it's going to fail. And that's actually a good protection for you to make sure that you don't have code that's taking a long time to run. So if your tests are failing over waits, it's probably that there's a performance concern in your code. In this case, it's not, because it's a hover behavior. But how would we fix that so that it works consistently, whether it's with our waits or otherwise? Well, a nice way to do this is you can actually forward the clock forward. So what we're going to do is when we hover, we want to fast forward. Time here, so that it not only happens more quickly because we're using fake timers, but then we've shortened that gap, so it's effectively like as if there was no time there. So the way we can do that is there's a few ways to do it. You could advance the timer by the time. This is one way. Now we should get an error here because we get the famous act error, and that's because we're doing some behavior that's going to trigger outside of React. And so if we go ahead and wrap this in an act clause, okay, and it did add that to my imports up there. It's off the React testing library, and it's actually just delegating to the React's testing utilities, a version of act, I believe. But if we were just wrap that in an act, do what it says, and you can see that it's passing, and our times are still really fast. This actually works really well. But a concern that I have with doing it this way is this time. I don't like that it's hard-coded. Wouldn't it be nice if, as this delay duration changes, like, it's not a big thing because it's not speeding up or slowing down our tests, but if we took and just went back to 500, would we want to change that back to 500? Or if we change this to 1500, then we have to change it. It just feels kind of bad. So there's other ways that we can do this. So instead of hard coding the seconds, another one, and I'll just write that right down here below, is let's see here. There's some other timers that you can use. Run only pending timers. This is a good one. It'll run any of them that it's waiting for to have timeout, regardless of the time that's on them. So we're going to comment out this one and run this run only pending timers instead. And of course it passes the same amount of speed. roughly that we've been getting. Now, the reason I like this, and this is okay, I believe, for a component test like this, is we've really only triggered one timer. We're triggering the hover timer before it displays the tooltip. So we've got a very narrow focus, so we can take some advantage of some things like this. And the nice thing here is regardless of what we set our delay time to on the tooltip, it's still going to pass and it's not going to worry about the time. So I'm going to set that back to 500 and we see our test is passing just fine. So this is a pretty cool way of actually testing those delays. One last thing I wanted to show here, we'll do the focus one really quick. Let's take that. So we're going to take the same things. We're going to change the UI, the test item here, the system under test, a little bit for the purposes of this test. And part of this is because if we're testing focusing, we need two things to be able to test focusing and unfocusing. We need something to focus on and then something else to focus on to remove the focus from it, or from our primary button. So we're going to add a second button here, and we'll just call this the unfocus button here. Okay. And then this is where having names on our roles will be really nice. So we should be able to take this, and it should still pass so far. That's not in the document. Now watch this. If I take the button, the name off of the get by role button, let's show you what it does here. It's going to get confused because there's actually get by returns a single element that matches that. But the problem is here is that we have two buttons. Two things with the role button. They happen to both be buttons that are on the page, and so it says I don't know what to give you. You could go get by all, or let's see, get all by role button, and then this would be an array, and then you could assign it trigger and unfocus. That's another way to do those, and then we have references to both of those. But I'm gonna stick with what I've been doing here. Be a little bit more explicit with these. So there's my trigger, because that one, if you had the array, then it assumes that there's a certain order to the elements too, and makes it less flexible. If I decide later that I really want my unfocus button first, then I have to rewrite my test or adjust all those in my test. This just makes it more consistent. So we know we've got our trigger, and now let's see here. We want to test this part. So let's just get that in here. That should all be the same, but what's our action that we're going to take? You have your arrange, we've set up everything, we've done an assert. Now we're going to take an action of, instead of hovering, focusing. So we're going to do trigger.focus. Okay, and we'll run this, and this should all work. Still all working great. And just sometimes it's good to fail your test just to make sure that everything's working right, that your assertions are working correctly. So I'm going to take that focus back out of there, and you can see, let's see, what is it failing? Unable to find role tooltip. So it's going through this and it never finds a tooltip. Why? Because we never focused. Now, one thing that's interesting about the tooltips, and we could actually take a lot of this stuff out with the focus. If you read the documentation on the radix one, here, tooltip radix, when you do a focus, it's got, where's its ARIA stuff here? Accessibility, keyboard interactions. So, it doesn't mention it here. But when you do, a lot of these when it's doing escape and closing, but if you give it focus, it also opens immediately. So we should be able to validate that that's the case. So we might be able to actually remove that and remove this. And we're going to take and change this to query by role, just because this element might be here or might not. So let's just change that and make sure our tests still work. And they still pass, of course. And the nice thing is because the reason we could switch this is because the element is supposed to immediately appear when we do focus, versus up above where it does the hover, it appears after a delay. So we're going to simplify that. We can take the async out of there. We don't need it now. And now we want to unfocus and see that the tooltip disappears. So we can't do like an unfocus. It's not really a way to do that, and that's why we created that other button here. So let's just do something like this. We'll do screen, get by role, button, whose name matches. Let's do unfocus like this. Like I said, you can use a regex for this. And that I means case insensitive. It's just for flexibility. Or you can use a string exactly like that. If it's short, it's not a big deal to do that. So we have the element. So at the end of this, we have the element, and now we want to do a focus on it. So we're moving the focus away from our trigger to just some other element. And right after that, we should expect that the element is no longer in the document. All right, perfect. So we have a test that is testing hover. We have a test that's testing focus. We also have a test that's just validating that the trigger appears on the screen as well, the way that we presented it. If you ever want to debug, so the last thing I want to do here really quick is show some debugging. Now this doesn't work perfectly in Wallaby, and that's why I'm showing it in the watch mode with just watch mode, although probably more of you are going to use just watch mode anyway. So I'll show this. So let's just take this original render, and suppose I'm having a hard time trying to figure out how to select things or what the tooltip's doing, and I want to see what it looks like. Let's do async here because we're going to do a little hover. Let's get our trigger. Let's see here. We got our trigger, and we're going to do a couple of things here. Yeah. Let's just suppose before we do the trigger, we want to take a look at what the content looks like on the page. So screen.debug, there's this debug function that's available. And the nice thing about it is it allows us to look at what the content is that it's rendered so far. Now you can see a linting error here, don't worry about it. So we'll do this, and I want you to look at the panel here, and this is what it's rendered on the page. So you can see our trigger, and you can see just it's got some other attributes on it that it adds with the component, but it's just from our debug thing. And so we could add that, and then we could actually do this part that hovers on the trigger and then presents it. Let's run screen.debug again. So we'll have two elements here. Sometimes this is useful to see, like it's almost like snapshots, but it's just like debugging output of what we see. So the first one we saw, it just had the trigger on the page, but then here in the second one we see the page, and it's got our trigger up here, but then it's also got all of this stuff that it added for the tooltip. And if we want to narrow that down even further, if we wanted to just see a portion of that to figure out what the tooltip has in it, we can just do stuff like this. You can go, you can put a selector or an element within the debug and narrow down what you're looking at. So we go get by role tooltip, and let's look at this panel here. And this is what it printed out. It's a lot smaller, and it gets kind of more to our style that we had on the page. And so you can narrow that down, and these selectors work great for other things too if you're trying to do a snapshot, which again we'll show. Let's actually show what a snapshot looks like on this. So let's take the debugs out, and let's just do expect not that expect screen get by role tooltip to match. And I love inline snapshots. They're not always, sometimes they get a little long, but if you can slice them down to small things, they work really well. So you'll see what it does here as well. So our test passed. Come on, you can do it. Oh, and this is why I don't like inline snapshots for some of this. We'll have to do some debugging, but you can see you could get an inline snapshot here. The reason it's failing is this property here, this radix ID. It's like a sequence number that changes, and so we'll probably want to narrow down even further on the specific stuff we're presenting here, but this is how we could fiddle around with the snapshots as well. Anyway, I hope that this has been a useful video for better understanding how you can test and interact with components that aren't just simply rendering a visual representation, but also something that the user is expecting to interact with. Hope you have a wonderful day, and happy testing.